Okay, let's do a review of Chapter 48, the nervous system. So it's characteristic of animals, except for sponges, to have a nervous system. In these radially symmetrical animals, like cnidarians here and sea stars, they don't have a brain. They have a nerve network, so they can respond to stimuli, but not really think about it. But when we move up to the bilaterally symmetrical animals, they begin to exhibit cephalization, have a head end in which you get a cluster of nerve cells that you could call a brain, and you begin to get sensory organs at that end of the body. And these sensory organs, the brain can get bigger, it does get bigger in certain animals, and the sensory organs can become more complex and sensitive as well, allowing that organism to process more information. Now, when we get up into the mammals, which we're focused on mammals, and particularly us, we'll see that the brain gets quite large, in particular the cerebrum, and this part of it, the neocortex, the outer covering of the cerebrum, gets quite developed and quite large. And so you can see in humans, compared to some other of our relatives out there, ours is quite large, giving us the ability to do lots of thinking and pondering. So there's the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and you can see the brainstem down here. Now we're going to talk about this in a little more detail later, but we'll see how we have different parts of our brain for different job. And we have different portions of our brain. We'll get to that, back to that in a minute. Now, so here's sort of the basic way it works. We have these sensory organs that have nerves connected to them that sense information. These are sent to the central nervous system via the sensory neurons, where it's processed, sometimes by just your spinal column, other times up in the higher parts of your brain. And then you have an output through motor neurons, or some kind of response. And again, this is all in your peripheral nervous system, and then the central nervous system comprises the brain and spinal column. And when you go to the doctor and they hit your knee with a mallet, they're basically testing your nervous system and if whether at a basic sense it's working. One of these automatic responses here where you get tapped on the knee and you get this response of jerking your knee. Okay, so the neuron is the basic unit of the nervous system, consisting of the cell body, the bulk of the cell, with its connected dendrites, the axon, this long thin part, and then the synaptic terminals, which connect to the adjacent nerve cell. The nerve system operates in a one-way fashion. So you've got information coming into the central nervous system, then you'll have nerves sending information back out. Notice the axon is surrounded by this stuff called myelin sheath, which basically insulates. It's analogous to the plastic or rubber that covers an electric cord. It's to keep an electric cord, it keeps the current flowing inside there, and with the myelin sheath, it keeps the nerve impulse traveling down the axon and constrained to the axon and not sort of spreading out and being dissipated. So a nerve cell in its resting state is what we described as being polarized. It's negative on the inside and positive on the outside. And so there it is. That's the resting state. It's negative on the inside. But what happens when there's a stimulus, that can cause a depolarization. Now, if the depolarization only goes up a little bit, you don't get a nerve impulse. But if you pass the threshold, you'll see you get this rapid depolarization and then a rapid repolarization. Okay? And so what's happening is when a nerve cell is stimulated, you get the influx of these sodium ions, which causes the rapid depolarization. It now becomes positive on the inside. But then once that's happened, the influx of sodium ions is cut off and a bunch of potassium ions flow out. That's the repolarization here, until you get back to the resting state. So stimulus starts up at the dendrites in the cell body from either a sensory organ or from a nerve cell that's connected to it, and that depolarization travels as a wave down the axon. First one part becoming depolarized, which stimulates the next unit, which stimulates the next unit, etc. And of course this happens very quickly, such that the nerve impulse is basically moving its way down the axon. Now when it reaches the end of the axon in the synapse, that depolarization at the end of the nerve stimulates the release of neurotransmitters, which travel into this synaptic space between two nerve cells. And on the next one, there are proteins on the dendrites and the cell body where the previous axon is connected that receive these neurochemical signals, causing this molecule, this protein in that nerve cell, to allow lots of ions to flow in, stimulating depolarization of that next neuron. All right, here are some of the different types of neurotransmitters. You don't have to memorize these, but some of them should be familiar, like dopamine and serotonin. And some of them are generally excitatory, that is, they stimulate other neurons to fire, and some are inhibitory, they sort of suppress nerve activity. Okay, so here's the central nervous system, again the brain and spinal column, and then the peripheral nervous system are all the nerves running off of that. You can see they're basically running off the spinal column, so any information that comes from the extremities into the spinal column has to run to the spinal column first before it goes up to the brain. So the brain, as we know, is divided into hemispheres, and when you look at the neocortex, or the outer layer of the cerebrum, you see you've got gray matter and white matter. Gray matter are usually a bunch of cell bodies, and the white matter are a bunch of axons running together and forming a network between all those nerve cells. Okay, so within the peripheral nervous system, we have the somatic system, and that's the voluntary actions, those skeletal muscles we can control. Then we have the autonomic system, the system we don't have to think about, breathing, our heart rate, our endocrine system, digestive system, and all those smooth muscles that surround it. The autonomic, the things we don't have to think about. Now notice within the autonomic, it's divided between the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and so when you look at that, you can see these generally encompass different kinds of reactions. So you see on the sympathetic side, inhibits the stomach and intestines, inhibits the pancreas, stimulates glucose release from the liver, stimulates the adrenal glands. So you can see this side is generally the excitatory stuff, the stuff that's getting you ready for action, whereas this is the side that's generally at a more resting state. So in this case, your stomach and intestines will operate for the most part. You'll digest things, stimulating the gallbladder, the release of the bile for digestion. So yeah, these are the things that are more resting state, and over here, these are the activities that are for a more active state. Development of the brain. Again, we can divide the brain into three main parts. You've got the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. And so here in the embryonic state, you've got the forebrain, which gives rise to the cerebrum, the diencephalon, which is at the base of the cerebrum and is a connection to the other parts of the brain, we'll see. The midbrain, the upper part of the brainstem, and then the hindbrain here developing into the cerebellum, and the lower parts of the brainstem, the medulla, and then the spinal column. Okay, so let's start from the brainstem, what's sometimes known as your reptilian brain. And so we have the medulla and the pons. And so what's happening here is, again, you've got the spinal cord where you're receiving information in, and in this portion of the brain, you're basically processing that information, and if it's of a certain type, that part of your central nervous system can process the information and you don't have to think about it. but some information has to be basically sent up to the cerebrum for you to think about. And so this midbrain is essentially where that information is being integrated, and a quote decision is made as to whether to be sent higher up for you to think about. So yes, at the upper portions of your brainstem is where that information is processed and sent up to the cerebrum if necessary. Now the cerebellum, as you're probably familiar, is important with coordination of motor movements, and it's also where you have memory of motor skills. And so when you practice something like playing the guitar or doing ballet or gymnastics or whatever, that's those motions, that's where the memory of those motions is stored. The diencephalon, so here we are basically at the base of the cerebrum. Here's the neocortex. So the diencephalon is at the base here. And so the epithalamus with the pineal gland, this is, as you may recall from the endocrine system, one that controls your circadian rhythms. Thalamus, which is where a lot of the information passes to and from your cerebrum, and then the hypothalamus, which is the connection with the endocrine system. So here's the diencephalon basically, and the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Again, your circadian rhythms are controlled here. And this is just a little graphic of a study of how we're sensitive to light and dark. And dark tells us when we should be sleeping. The dark bars represent being asleep. And so when people are taken out of that light-dark cycle, the cycle tends to drift because you don't have the circadian rhythm, the light-dark, controlling that system. And so you can see when the person is kept in the dark for a number of days, they begin to sleep at very random times and for shorter periods of time than when they have a very distinct night and day. They don't have that signal anymore. All right, the cerebrum. So divided into two hemispheres. Corpus callosum connects them, the neocortex being the outer layer of the cerebrum with all the folded part. Divided into the four lobes again: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe in the back, the temporal lobe on the side. And so you see we have all these different areas, these frontal association area, auditory association area, visual, somatosensory association area. And so different activities are controlled by different parts of the brain. If you look here, particularly the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. The motor cortex is where we control particular motions. So if I want to move my tongue, then there's a particular part of the motor cortex where that activity is controlled. Somatosensory, so when I receive information on my tongue, that information of associating what's happening to my tongue is stored there, or my elbow, or my forearm, whatever the case might be. Language and speech are stored here, and so there are different parts of the brain that control these activities. And here's some scans from functional MRI that different parts of the brain become much more active, whether you're hearing words or seeing words or saying them or thinking about what you're going to say. Emotions. See, I'm just about out of time here, so we're going to cut this video off and we'll get to emotions in just a second. Thanks.